I don't expect to make a living out of my work. If I did, I'd be dead many, many years ago. So I'm 72 now, and I basically live on the pension. You know, I haven't sold a painting for a long time, but I haven't exhibited. And the thing is, if you don't do what the public want, well, you can't blame anyone if your work doesn't sell. But how would you feel if you're doing what you think is going to sell? Because this is, you know, and they don't buy it, then you really will be up the creek, wouldn't you?
Well, Tony Wood's a painter and one who's continuing to paint it.
An artist who lives around the corner from me, but yeah, legendary Australian artist in my mind.
Who obviously hasn't received the recognition in the last kind of 30 years.
I see Tony as a quintessential Melbourne painter, even though he considers himself to be a Tasmanian.
Well, he's a very gifted painter that I first met in Tasmania. I think of him as a Tasmanian painter.
Tony was a fine draftsman, is a fine draftsman, no question about that.
Tony Woods is an artist who has been around for a long time without ever really becoming fully known to the broader public. He's what we might call an artist's artist.
Tony Woods is a painter who's primarily interested in light and playing games with light.
He is a major painter covering many styles and many periods, as a good artist always does.
He's an artist, he's a painter and a filmmaker, and he's had a long career and done a lot of different things.
This wonderful recluse painter that I met in the 80s.
One of our very significant, probably most significant pop artists. I think Tony Woods is the closest thing Australia had to David Hockney.
When I was a child, my mother was a dressmaker, and I used to help her with the dressmaking, doing the sketching around the pattern with the French chalk, cutting the pattern. She'd model the half-made dress, and she'd get me to do the hemline, armpits, with French chalk, and so that helped me learn to draw in single lines. Actually, one day I must have been could have been about 8, or under 10 anyway. I saw a female watercolourist painting near our house, and being a little kid, she allowed me to come up and sit next to her. So I sat very quietly and watched her, and I found it quite fascinating seeing her technique, and I knew nothing about it. And then later, a week later or something, I saw her again, and of course I rushed over and sat next to her again. And this time I think she probably thought I was going to be there, because she had a little pad. She gave me a pad and a brush, and so she was ready for me. And so she let me fiddle around and gave me a few little instructions. At the school I went to, I had a very good art teacher. His name was Alan Gelston, and he was a watercolourist and a sculptor. And he really took a fancy to me, thought I had talent, and really encouraged me. We all did watercolours in the class for art, but gave me extra instructions and stuck my work up on the wall. So all that sort of helps you think, well, I'm okay. And then, so after a while, you keep on with it and you become more serious, and then someone pats you on the back and sort of says, oh, I like what you do. Look, I've got a small place, I show art. Why don't I show some of your work, and if I can sell some, I'll take a small commission and you'll earn some money that way. You just keep on doing what you want to do. And so you do that, and it's very romantic. And when I sold my first painting as an adult, I was told, congratulations, you've sold your painting. I said, no, I can't have it. No. Oh, no. And of course, I even cried a bit. And then I went home, and my father said, you're an idiot. You put the thing in for sale, you sold it, congratulations, go back and apologise. So actually I found out who the person was had bought the watercolour, and I wrote to her and explained where it was painted from, and she wrote back and said, I've got some streetings and some other important art, and I really value your work. Thank you for the information, and I'll insure it and look after it.
think we've got one of his earliest watercolours too, of the Tasman Bridge, which is a fantastic watercolour, where it shows the Tasman Bridge under construction, where he was at Rosny Point looking up the Derwent with Mount Direction. But the colours, and again that sense of drawing and line, it's a very vibrant work.
Those images that he made of the bridge, they were better than anything that was being done or has been done. I was quite surprised to see them, how complicated they were and how expertly they were handled.
The thing that really took me was he was originally part of those beautiful watercolours that people were doing at Tasmania. And some of them were just wonderful.
I exhibited with most of the watercolourists who are older than me in Hobart. As I said, I thought they were all very fine, and most of them are still working now. But I think the idea for a group show was Max Angus's.
We had an exhibition. This is before Tony, or just after he became a member, and a man named Roy Cox, fine watercolour painter himself, and invited Tony to show with this Tasmanian group of painters exhibition. Tony, for some reason best known to him, performed his own revolution. He took a lot of matchboxes and cut them up into irregular pieces and stuck them on top of the traditional watercolours that he'd been painting all the years and that Roy had admired. And Roy looked at it and said, "The bastard."
Because I used to smoke in those days, and probably while I was doing the watercolour, I probably put cigarette pack on the top of the watercolour paper, which is dry, at the part at the top, or that could be the matchbox. And I suddenly saw it as a trompe l'oeil playing around with illusion. So you've got your flat piece of paper which suggests your landscape, but on top of it you've got a matchbox with a shadow on the paper. So, and that's still, I've done a lot of work with it over the years. Harry Bucky, who actually gave me some instructions in watercolour, one thing he said to me, make sure when you're painting clouds that there's nothing figurative in the clouds. Like, you know, no dog or a cat or a house or a person, which I thought, I'm going to go against that. If I can see a dog and make a cloud, I'll put it in there. You know, so I was also a young rebel in a way. I mean, these are older, wiser in some ways, but I had a bit of a rebel in me. You know, arrogance, you know, yes, I plead guilty.
A few artists would get together in a coffee shop and talk about, you know, if you like, the latest trends or whatever. No groundbreaking, but just a friendly communication between artists. And so Tony always stood out as a personality in that group. Always looking a little bit different, hair a little bit wild, never a conformist.
He was more experimental, he was more daring, he was somehow more in touch, I think, with what was happening. I think these other people, very talented and very gifted people, I think they'd found their niche. And for a lot of them, the niche was Tasmanian watercolours, Tasmanian landscape.
So I started out as a watercolourist. Most painters in Tasmania were watercolourists. It's a very strong state, known for that. And some people did narrative scenes in oil, but I did watercolours. And then I decided, when I finished my art course, that I should start painting oil paint, because it's a more serious medium. So I started doing oil landscapes.
He's always been able to have a very high level of skill, but then turn his back on it, which is, you know, basically what an artist gets to distrust his facility in a medium that comes so easily. And for him, watercolour came too easy. The effects were too easy to achieve. So that's when he moved into more challenging, the simplest forms of coat hangers, the thing I remember in particular.
One day I came back from painting an oil landscape, and in my studio in Hobart, I noticed a coat hanger lying on the floor near a window, casting a beautiful shadow, plus a patch of light on the floor. It had probably been there for a month or so, and I just stepped over it. This time I actually noticed it. And I thought, that's a beautiful subject. Why do I go trudge a long way to paint oil landscapes? So I stopped doing landscape completely and started painting interiors, shirts, coat hangers, ties, chairs, areas of light.
He became quite well known for a brief period in Hobart was his paintings of coat hangers. And the coat hanger paintings were sort of a little bit too much for the Hobart art establishment to comprehend, because he liked to take a simple subject but then elaborate it into strong, simple images, but always with another element of meaning to them. They were almost became symbols.
Tony can draw with minimal line that indicates great comprehension of structure. So he knows when musculature is tight or when it's loose, when it's convex or when it's concave, when it's behind or when it's in front, when it's stretching, when it's folding. And you don't pick that up by those other processes. Some of those drawings, it might sound almost cheesy, but some of those drawings of children at the breast of a woman being fed, the fold of a baby's wrist and fingers, not easy to do.
There's my first coat hanger painting. Bent, the first one I ever did, first oil painting. There's a still life. And here's another version of the tie hanging. That's just a tie. But say that corner there, if that was a corner of my flat, if I just put a nail here, put a cord across, that's the clothesline. And so you can hang things on it, and then of course the shadows are cast on either one or two walls. And I like that leading in, which is that's why that was a very strong image.
A lot of his work combined the best of some of the modern artists and his own style embodied with it. And I go along with that. I think we can all be influenced by painters' work that we don't want to copy, but there's something about it that gets to you and you see, yes, that the addition of the modern art movement was important. So Tony became a leading figure in Tasmanian art, yes.
I kept on painting the interiors. I call them studioscapes. And also sometimes I had a big mirror, so I painted myself in the mirror and also included my budgerigars, and I had a Rosella parrot wandering around the studio as well. And but I felt that I was becoming a little bit introverted and a little bit isolated from people. I was still only very young, and I thought I'm going to have to pull up the blinds metaphorically, change my clothes, clean myself up and start going out and meeting people, go to openings. Instead of sitting in the front row of the pictures, stay back in the crowd a bit and meet a few people. And then I started to go to parties and I'd meet some young person. I'd say, would you like to model for me, male or female? Some would say, no, not interested. But then there were some that did like to model, and I had some regular ones. And then someone would visit me and I'd say, how long you got? They'd say maybe 3/4 of an hour, 2 hours. And so I'd have to make up a composition straight away and paint them. And then they'd leave. The next day someone else might turn up and I'd add them to the painting.
His early figurative works, which weren't necessarily about learning how the body works or the body is, or learning some sort of, he was never classicist. It's not about some sort of ideal idea of the body or of a person. He wasn't trying to to reproduce Roman still lifes, Roman statues or anything. He was actually trying to draw what was in front of him at the time.
And I became more and more interested in movement, because I'd say to the model, anything hurting? Would you like to move something? And they might say, look, my leg's going to sleep, or my arm, and I'd say, oh, you move it. And then they might move it, and I'd say, oh, hold that. That's fantastic. So then I'd do a second movement, say an arm or a leg. And I got very interested in that. Then they'd leave, And then the next day or the day after, someone else would turn up, and I'd have to add them to the first image to make a composition. I had a very sparsely furnished studio. You know, that meant, you know, 1 or 2 chairs and really nothing. So there were no props like in a Matisse painting, fish bowls and all sorts of flowers and things. So I was mainly just interested in the figure and the movement. I wasn't particularly concerned with light on the figure. That came and went. Because at one stage I thought light's too temporary. You know, it's like I believe in like the Oriental art where light is not important. It's something more lasting. So a figure without light on it is, but light does give form. Like at art school I discovered the use of coloured paper for life drawing. If you've got a colour, say brown, green, blue, you can get pastel, lighter colour, lighter tone in that paper, and you can go for light. So when you're looking at the figure, you don't have to draw the dark parts of it. You can suggest that, because sometimes you haven't got time, but you can go for light. Whereas if you're drawing with white paper, you dirty the paper to get form. And you're actually drawing shadow. You're not drawing light.
I think, you know, the ability to define what he has is a very rare quality.
Is what I call early work, and you can see there where he built up a very solid reputation. Pop influences were coming through at a period where those in Melbourne knew very little about pop until the big major 2 decades of American painting exhibition here.
When I finished my art diploma, I think in 1963, and then I came across the mainland with a friend. He was an art student too, so we went around the galleries looking for a place where I might be able to get an exhibition. And I went to galleries in South Yarra, Richmond, and then I ended up at Australian Galleries in Collingwood. And I met the owner, Tam Purvis, the director, and I said, well, you know, and I was only 23, sorry, and I finished my diploma, I'm a painting, and showed him, I think, some slides, just a thing of slides on a sheet. And would he be interested? And he said, well, listen, Tony, we only show 5 artists here in this gallery, Sidney Nolan, Arthur Boyd, Louis Kahn, Fred Williams, and someone else. But I like your spunk, send some stuff over. So I sent some stuff over.
He was a real presence in that 60s period, and when I started with my parents in 1966, they had good contact with Tony Woods at that stage. And my father, Tam Purvis, was particularly fond of Tony. And there was very good reason for it, because Tony was even then unusual, and he could draw like an angel. It was quite remarkable, actually.
Australian Galleries was founded in 1956 by the Purvis family. It was one of the 3 major galleries in Melbourne at the time. It might even be considered by many to be the top gallery at the time.
Kim Bonython from Adelaide, a very wealthy man, but an art dealer, he saw my show at Australian Galleries, and he had some sort of business relationship with Australian Galleries. So he wrote me a letter from Adelaide, I was living in Hobart still, saying send him some slides. He'd seen my show, but I sent him some slides of my work. And I wrote back and said, I don't have any slides, because I didn't have a camera. He sent me back, I think it was 50 guineas or so, 50 pounds. I think it was that much. Sent me some slides. Sent it to Kim. He made a selection of works, and those are the ones I sent to him. I went across for the show. I think it was moderately successful. So in the end, I did start showing with him in Sydney as well. But that, at this time, initially, it was Australian Galleries in Melbourne and Kim Bonython in Adelaide. They were my mainland dealers. My work got some attention, and I got the Harkness Fellowship in '68, same time as Brett Whiteley. He got his from London, but I got mine from Hobart, and that entailed me to have 21 months in New York painting.
Firstly, to position the Harkness Fellowship, it's easier to think in terms of the Rhodes Scholarship. A Rhodes Scholarship is a sort of 2-year scholarship which is awarded to, significant young talents. For example, Bob Hawke got a Rhodes Scholarship. That took him to Oxford University. Other people, Edward de Bono got a Rhodes Scholarship. Sir Zelman Cohen got a Rhodes Scholarship. Well, the Harkness was an American equivalent, so instead of taking you to Oxford University, it took you to America.
When I arrived at the airport, I didn't know where I was supposed to go. And being stupid, I even got them to hail. Anyone here to meet Tony Woods from Tasmania? God, no one. Because I didn't know, what am I supposed to do? So then luckily I rang this woman, I looked at the phone book, and there's only a Harkness in it, was this Rebecca Harkness, who must get really pissed off, because she's she's got a ballet company, no relationship whatsoever to Harkness, because they had no children. So she's got these Harkness people ringing up, I bet, a lot about things. And her secretary or something said, look, you ring up the secretary or something. They knew they had the number already there. I rang her up, she said, oh, Martha English, I know her name was. Go to Hotel Victoria Abbey, your room's there, and then come and see me tomorrow morning. And I didn't have a studio yet, so I was looking for a studio. Then I talked to Stanley Bard, the manager of the Chelsea, and one of his people at the Chelsea was a French sculptor who had a studio just up the road, and he talked to him, he said, yes, just at the moment there is a room. And Brett's studio was just around the corner too. So Bob Jacks was on the corner, opposite me. So, a little hub. Well, I started getting, first of all, the Rorschach, big Rorschachs, and I'd have them, I'd take them to the Chelsea and stick them up on the wall, the pins. So you'd arrive back at the Chelsea with the canvas rolled up. No one took any notice of you, because everyone in the hotel would be an artist of some sort. You get in the lift there with paint on you. There could be another artist in the corner, actress, musician, Jimi Hendrix or something. No one sort of, they just took it for granted. You're not a businessman or something, you're an artist.
Nolan was one of the first Australian artists to be awarded a Harkness Fellowship, but that was 10 years before Tony was, and he chose to go to stay at the Chelsea Hotel. The Chelsea Hotel has a very specific history of patronising specific artists. There's so many artists that have gone.
In the meantime, I'd started seeing all the great paintings at the Whitney and Guggenheim Museum of Modern Art, and I'd met Brett Whiteley at a studio nearby, and I'd seen things that I was interested in, but I really wasn't looking at people, and I didn't really know anyone, and everyone was far too busy. But one day a model knocked on the door, and looking for another artist in the building who I didn't know, but I said, oh, you're a model, well, you can model for me. He said, okay, and we picked a date, he came, so I had everything ready, he stripped off his clothes, and I said, no, sorry, I don't mean to insult you, but I'm not going to do figurative work because I just don't feel it anymore. That was Hobart, that was my friends, and it was a different situation. I've got different feelings now, I'll pay you, and but I'm going to have to make the next step, which takes courage. And so I did, and I started looking at things, the footpaths and splodges of tar on the footpath, and I started doing abstract paintings.
The fact that he took up abstraction, he went from being a figurative painter to an abstract painter, I think is actually really important, because he took up he was there to learn from New York culture. And what was on the table was abstraction.
And then many years later, I recently read a book talking about the American painter Gorky. He and Noguchi, the Japanese sculptor, they walked together in Manhattan, just relaxing, and they were concentrating on the stains as well on the footpath. And Gorky was always saying, look at that, how that relates to that. There's a composition there, and all that sort of stuff. So it just made me feel that what I'd started was I was on the right track. The last works I did, which was quite a long period in New York, I was dropping lines. I'd have a container of paint and a brush, small brush, and at the top of the canvas it would be vertical, and I'd hold the brush on the edge of the canvas and just drop the paint down the canvas. And that was very exciting, because according to the weave of the canvas, the paint would make its own way down the canvas. So if the paint rivulet came upon some sort of misperfection in the canvas, it would deviate and it became like a vein. And as I've got older now, even now here in Australia, I'm very interested in my veins because they're so prominent in my arms. You see, the blueness underneath the pink skin. So I did a lot of works of just letting the colours run down the canvas, sometimes right to the bottom, and then I'd use other colours, and then you get that optical. Is the green in front of the blue? Is the blue? But they're all on the white. They are all on the canvas, so it's on the same surface. But the blue looks as though it's in front of the pink, or the pink looks in front of the yellow. After about 7 months in New York, I had to send a certain amount of canvases back, rolled up. I took them off their stretchers, rolled them up and sent them back to Australian galleries, and then when I think they were horrified, really. They restretched them.
This is true of quite a lot of Australian artists, is that they were seduced by Americanism, and that they would go away from a small country to a really massive city environment, a city with the same population as Australia at that stage, and be totally seduced by New York school, it's cool if you like, and really in a way they were converted to that, and it stole what they were about, rather than use it as an experience and to come back and give strength to their own work. They came back and tried to be Americans in Australia, in my view. It's happened on several occasions. And for me, it sent Tony off to a track in another direction entirely. And in fact, we found that we couldn't represent the work anymore at that point.
I think the only two people that liked them, one was Robin Boyd, the architect. He chose one of those paintings to take to China. And my future partner, unbeknownst to me, she bought one of the prints on paper, which is, I think it's because when I got to know her, really in the 70s, she had the work. I couldn't believe it, That's fate, really.
The issue which every artist probably considers internally, but is viewed externally as being consistent or changing, giving themselves the privilege of going through different styles or different phases. There's no right or wrong about that. Many people are pluralist and some people are singular. Tony, I think, is actually singular, but the word that comes to mind for me with Tony is not so much consistent as thorough. He's incredibly thorough.
The Rorschachs were planar. That means on the ground. You've got to paint flat, otherwise the acrylics roll, they go everywhere. And I even made myself a container of plywood with 2x1 by the edges and put plastic inside like a little tank of water, and I could lay the canvas inside that frame, and then I could pour on the acrylic, and I had this very wide broom sweep the paint onto the canvas. I remember once Brett Whiteley was in my studio. It was late in the afternoon. We were going to go to Kansas City. There was a knock at the door, and there was two black guys there saying, "Have you got a broom?" For some reason, I didn't recognise them, but I didn't know a lot of people in the building. And I was standing near Brett, and I had the bloody broom in my hand. Broom said, no, we haven't got any brooms here. And they're all looking at me. What about that one? But he said, he uses that as a brush.
Brett Whiteley, who was his close companion in those days, knew him by the name Seagull. And so this character became known as Seagull. And when people said, Tony Woods, never heard of him, but Seagull, I know that guy. It was like there are two individuals out there.
Brett's dialogue was sort of poetic, and and he'd relate everybody to some sort of bush creature or something, or a wild creature. I remember one time we were out, and he said, Gull's coming. I said, who's Gull? This is when I'm sort of meeting him. A seagull. You mean seagull? Oh, Gull, yeah, it's seagull. Why do you call him Seagull? And I never found out, why he became the Gull. But it was like, when you really think about it, he is a bit like that, the wandering seagull, in the head, and he just flies around.
Brett was also one of those. Occasionally, you find it, people that are getting tremendous publicity at the time. They act as a magnet to people, and of course usually the people are busy talking to the magnet and waving to those who are attracted to the magnet. There is one thing that I would like to make, is that although we might say Tony was part of that circuit, Tony, among the cognoscenti, was given great respect. He was not regarded solely as a hanger-on to a celebrity. He'd established himself, he was painting very interesting things, and he had collectors' respect independently of whether he was a member of a circle. And of course artists, no different from any of us, we all have groups of friends.
Well, the fire took place such a long time ago, it's vague, but it's probably November 1969. It was in the morning, I was asleep in the building, and I woke up with noise, unusual noise, and staggered out of bed, went to the window which was overlooking 7th Avenue, and there were all these people looking up at me, and the lights were flashing, and the fire engines and screaming, the sirens, and smoke was coming into my room. So I put some trousers over my pyjamas, and grabbed a few clothes on, just rushed down the stairs and joined the crowd out in the audience downstairs. And then the smoke was then really into my building, into my room. I only had one room, but as I was on 7th Avenue. I think the fire started on 23rd Street, which because it was a corner building, opposite Brett's studio somewhere. There was an entrance. So I was able to save a small attaché case through quick thinking with Noel Sheridan's wife, who told the fireman, and the fire wasn't in my room at the time. The smoke was getting very bad, but the fire was coming in, and they found the attaché case, held up to the window and said, and I said yes. So then they relayed it down, but I had my passport in it and photos and letters and all my private papers, and so that was. Then I went back to live at the Chelsea. So I lost all my 18 months Harkness paintings and all my possessions, everything, except this attaché case and the clothes I was standing in.
We were to visit Tony Woods in New York at his Harkness, and we had trouble finding the address in New York because there was chaos there for whatever reason, and we realised then there'd been a big fire, and we came around the corner to what we thought was Tony's building, and it had burnt down as we walked to it, and it was in the middle of winter, and as they were spraying it with water to put the flames out, it was so cold the water as it dripped off the building was freezing, so it was sort of like icicles coming down the side of it.
The studio below him in New York, the artist left the heater on, the studio caught fire, it burnt through the bookshop and eventually took down Tony's studio and all of the work that he'd done in New York. So that just obliterated everything and left Tony in a traumatised state. So you get this double whammy of Australia not being that interested in abstraction at the time, despite the significance of the influences that he was taking up, with the fire on top of that, and it led to deep trauma, I think.
I had to turn down the Power Studio, which Elwyn Lynn and Professor Bernard Smith had arranged for me. They did all the paperwork, so that when the Harkness finished in 1970, I'd go for 6 months to Paris for 6 months. But they arranged all that. But I just had to turn it down because I had no money and I was in a state of shock. And I couldn't make it. I couldn't do it.
That Tony walked out of that fire traumatised, I'm no doubt about that, and probably under the circumstances he was probably in a state. It might have been better if he had have, just gone, well, I've lost everything, but I'll go on to Paris and I will start again. But he didn't. He was traumatised and thought, I'm ruined, send me back.
An Irish patron, a friend of mine, Lord Talbot Malahide, had read about the fire in Hobart. He had a property in Tasmania. Then I'd gone to London and I was staying with a friend of his, and he sent a cheque for 2,000 Irish pounds as a gift because he was so shocked about the fire that I knew that I lost so much, and which was absolutely wonderful. It was a lot of money at the time. That's 1969, end of it, or 1970, early.
When we look at the fire, after the fire, Tony left. Tony was given a place back at the Chelsea Hotel in exchange for a painting which he left for them, which looks, you could look at that painting and think it's a relatively slight painting in relation to either A, his figurative work, or the cremated abstraction that he was working on up until that point. This is a painting of an empty coat hanger, in fact. But I think of that work as being very much influenced by some of the conceptual art of the time.
Before I went to America, I showed with Kim in Sydney, in his Sydney gallery. And as far as him again, when I came back from New York, I had a show with him of works that I did in Sydney, in my Oxford Street studio. I don't think they were all that successful because I was finding it difficult to get going again. But there was a mixture of abstract and some figurative work. Some of it was okay, but I wouldn't say it's my best show. But because I found it hard, I found it much easier to establish myself in New York after Hobart, which sounds silly, than to establish myself again in Sydney compared to New York. I might find that hard to explain, but it was a jolt. Because in New York, you're so crowded, it's so you don't see people. There's so many. You're just in a crush of crowds and buildings. There's no sky. Come back to Sydney, it's summer. Everyone's in thongs, shorts, t-shirts, and there's blue sky, and you're looking back to bodies again. And so then I started thinking of figures again, whereas I didn't in New York. So I was a bit mixed up for a while, but I got myself going. The saving grace for me was when Brett was invited to have a house for a month or so in Palm Beach, and he thought my studio in Oxford Street was too small, so he invited me to come and join him at Palm Beach. And I had the studio downstairs, he worked in his garage upstairs, he was doing Rimbaud and Baudelaire and Van Gogh, and I was doing vegetation around the place, around this very nice house, and Palm Beach, people on the beach and the rocks and the sea, and anything that's inspired me. But I got going at Palm Beach.
What's interesting about Tony Woods' take on pop art is that it's kind of pop and it's kind of a bit larrikin as well. It has a real Australian inflection to it. So clearly he was influenced by the zeitgeist of the times. He was a person of his times, and he decided to use that very fully in his work. So his work moved very, very quickly from, fairly internalised subjects and quite traditional subjects to work that looked very overtly contemporary, but still with something of a personal and, I think, Australian flavour.
Back to Melbourne, and then I started I still did some pot plants, which was a link with the bonsai, I suppose. I had this interesting pot plant. Then we got this property at Denali. My partner bought this small farm, 23 acres, and had a barn, which I used as a studio. So I started going over there for school holidays, and Stella got a little bit older, and also just to go over for a break before she'd gone to school. And we continued for several years. But I started doing farm subjects, cows, bulls, horses, bones you'd find, like sheep bones, sheep. We had a jetty, so I started doing the starfish prints. When I took the children paddling over on our part, they trod on starfish and they didn't like that, so I'd get the starfish out of the water and tip them upside down onto the jetty, and then come back the next day. They would have died because of the sun on their underside, throw them into the water. But I noticed they left a stain on the wood, so I decided to put paper down, weighed down with rocks in the corners of the paper, and put starfish on the paper. And I did, and I got all those prints. And each studio gets new subject matter. And we got rid of the property in Denali, so we no longer went there. So the barn door series had finished. But here in the studio in Fitzroy, there's a certain light situation that takes place. It's not like the barn, it's something like the barn door actually. And so I noticed it, so I started dealing with that.
Tony's light paintings tend to feature these very thin white rays of light that are like snakes that sort of slide over every surface in the painting. and they can assemble themselves into new objects regardless of what they originally depicted.
What he's talking about is the primacy of the experience of just looking at paint or a shape. So he's gone from looking at something that's in front of him in this environment to looking at this work that he's building up.
So all my light works, which I'm doing for about 12 years, are based on what happens in 6 months of each year with a certain light situation. But I also should say that even in Hobart, when I didn't have a model, I depended on my friends knocking on the door to visit. So in between, when no one was around, unless I'd asked someone, I was doing abstract work, just because it's a joy to paint. The interesting thing was, I thought with film, since it's a moving thing, not a photograph, I'd film some of my painting subjects. And then in the meantime, I thought, what would happen if I I'm always doing this sort of thing, using one of my child's still as kaleidoscopes, looking at reality. When I'm waiting for a bus, I have one in my pocket and look at things. I thought, well, what if I put the kaleidoscope in front of the Super 8 lens, And then I did it to the light. I thought, look what it does to the light, it diffracts it. And so I did 2 more reels on that, and everyone's knocked out by it. I mean, that's my first film called Real Light.
He would just take situations that were in front of him at the time, and then he found film that could do that as well. Just instantly describe a moment and somehow translate that moment in its beautiful simplicity and sensory rawness.
I think he doesn't really come from, even though he is an experimental filmmaker, in some ways he doesn't come from a tradition of experimental filmmaking. He's kind of invented his own approach to filmmaking. I think part of it is that compared to other experimental filmmakers, he doesn't experiment so much with what you can do with the film after you've shot it, like, sort of using an optical printer or, doing superimposition, stuff like that. What he shoots is something that he's seen. And, if you were there, when he was shooting, you could see it too. So he is sort of using the camera as a recording device. That's one thing that comes to mind.
But then after a while, I started to notice that my film started to influence the paintings I was doing. Because when you see your image done with a kaleidoscope on film and slide and video, it gives you ideas, because painting's much slower. And so with a slide, for instance, of diffracted light or diffracted something, which is caused by the kaleidoscope, I can take and get a colour print made, laser print or whatever they call it, square it up, and I could do a painting. And then after a while, I didn't need to square it up because I could understand it.
What he does is to present a cinematic viewpoint on a canvas, and also to use the effects of painting inside film. So the result is that you can get a kaleidoscopic lens effect in a painting, or a blurred light effect on a painting, and then in the film he'll use his canvases as inspiration for some of the light structures.
What I enjoy about his work, his approach to abstraction, is it's sort of informed by experimental film. And it's that whole feeling that you have in film and sound and in video imagery happening on a canvas. So the paintings don't look static, they look like they're moving. And they're almost like frames that could be in a film.
It was all very exciting, it was all very creative. It took me away from art a bit. It took me away from my art opening, so I got a bit isolated as far as art, but I was so happy because there's a lot of very nice people. In the Super 8 was a pretty big group. We had monthly screenings. I enjoyed it.
When I first saw his films in the 90s, I think the sound was almost what struck me most about them. I didn't know then either that he had the habit of just fitting different soundtracks to the same films, that the soundtracks in the films kind of weren't, all one. But what sort of fascinated me was the sense of you have a film on the one hand, and then you get voices or sounds that seem to be coming from somewhere totally different, that they just, a different channel of information that wasn't exactly commenting on the film, but which sort of gave it more of a sense of something you experience in life, where you walk down the street and everything isn't sort of unified into, into one vision, there's sort of stimuli coming at you from different directions that might or might not connect up.
What's the 12? What time we going?
So I had a cassette recorder, and I've always liked music, and I always listen to sounds around me. So I thought, I know what to do. I'll just walk around Fitzroy with the tape recorder and just pick up ambient sounds. Because if I'm filming, I can't record at the same time, because I'm not using sound film. I'm not using a sound camera. So I'm shooting silent, and also say I'm filming a bee inside a flower getting pollen, and there's a helicopter goes above. Well, it's got nothing to do with, if I recorded that, it's got nothing to do with the bee and the pollen. It could be his wings, but you know what I mean? It mightn't be apt. So I found just by walking down the street, holding it on the, near the ground and picking up buskers and people talking, snatches of conversation, go past shops and a bit of music played, and then I'd use that, put it on cassette and play that with the film.
There's a direct correlation between his sound output and his painting. It's very much to do with observations of living in the present, of collecting and observing what's around him.
I think he's probably actually one of the last people regularly making Super 8 films in Australia. I understand he continued well into the 21st century, which not many other people did. I think I know about 3 people still doing it. So it's just, a form that maybe has, for the moment, gone by the wayside. I think, well, obviously the sort of unfortunate thing about this is it makes it very unlikely that many people will get to see these films as they were originally shot. There's not a lot of people holding Super 8 screenings around town now.
For 3 years, up to 2001, I ran the group. People were dropping out because you couldn't do sound film anymore. And less people were coming. The membership fees were some people weren't paying their membership. I was the coordinator running it. Our equipment was starting to break down. The rent was going up. Everything was increasing, so and less people were coming. So then we said we were going to close this, and the membership agreed, so I closed the group. And I thought, no, I want to get back to my painting, just concentrate on painting. For the past 5 years, because of I've still got some fairly serious health problems. My knees are very wonky also. I can't do big paintings like I used to. I used to be able to just put a stretcher on the ground, a canvas, big one, get down on my knees and staple it and all that sort of stuff, and just so I can't, if I did that now I couldn't get back up. My knees are just too suspect. It's just age, you can't do anything about it. So I now paint on an ironing board because I'm doing abstract. If I was doing something figurative, I'd use an easel, because you've got a top and a bottom, like you've got a head and a foot, whatever, vertical. But since I'm doing abstract, I can paint it flat, and I can paint from 4 sides, like Pollock in a way, like he did. He painted all these things, just the canvas on the ground. Well, I'm doing it on an ironing board because the height is just perfect. I call it planar in a way because you're looking down as though you're looking down at the ground, not as though it's on the wall vertical. And there is that strange thing is that when you finish the painting, you say well, that's as far as I can go. I don't want to do anything else. That's when it's flat. Also, it's acrylic. You don't want the acrylic to run. That's why it's not good to do it vertical. Then you have to put it on the wall to look at it. Ideally, that should be shown on the ground. You know what I mean? But that's impossible. Or on the roof ceiling.
There is a lightness of touch. There's a use of silhouettes. There's a use of almost stencils in the work. They're not really stencil painting, but almost stencil painting sensation in the work.
Once you see the abstract paintings, you can see what he's doing in those early paintings. You see, it's as if the latest work that he's doing is a kind of lyrical expression without the need to have all these other sort of elements in it, all these representational things. Without the need to have those, he can show you what the essence is of what he's doing.
What's interesting about how his trajectory went is that, like a lot of Australian artists, he was celebrated very early on, and in his case, if he had perhaps stuck more doggedly to one style of working, maybe it might have helped his career, but it would not have been so good for him as an artist. So in some ways, Australian artists can pay the price for moving around a little bit too much, you know, within their work, I mean.
Something that happened to Tony that wasn't satisfying, it wasn't satisfying for himself. I don't quite know what it was, but he deserted, in my view, the real quality that he had, which was his observation of human nature and the ability to draw that in the most beautiful and simple way, and yet, you know, keep the complication going. And I would have felt that he could have actually developed that into something that was very special in this country and lasted. But it wasn't to be. He then turned into, I think that the sort of American influence again, the total abstract period, which is, you know, an incredibly important thing, abstraction, because it was behind all of his work. But his real talent was in the drawing.
I think what's fascinating about Tony Woods, for me, is that he is, as a role model, a real artist's artist. You know, someone who really, essentially he aspired to make work, and he had that early desire to be an artist. So you see in his trajectory that he moves from work that's very traditional and incredibly skillful. And he could have stayed there, but bit by bit he moved forward. He contemporised, he took the world in, he used it in his work in, you know, intelligent and sometimes very unorthodox, even wayward ways came into his way of working, all the time looking and remaining deeply curious about both what was around him and how to make his work. That's the thing that I think is particularly interesting about him, that he is now an older artist in his 70s, and that curiosity that was evident in the making of those works as he was, you know, travelling the road of his art is absolutely alive and well.
I sometimes sit in my studio, Roy, and I look at my work, I think, you see, you've got to look at it painting for painting. If you said, now, Tony Woods, yes, he paints landscapes, doesn't he? Yeah, you know. And you got him. You know, that's Tony Woods, like Sydney. But with me, they'd say, oh yeah, well, he was a figurative artist, wasn't he? Oh yeah, well, that was in the 60s. He doesn't do much figurative art, he did that in the 70s, 80s. He's now more, then he was doing these things about light. Oh yeah, I saw those. And someone might interrupt and say, yes, but now isn't he an abstract painter? He does, and he makes films, doesn't he? Well, I do all those things, you know, but I mean, not all at the same time, in certain stages, but you've got to look at painting for painting. If you're talking about figurative art, yeah, I got some figurative. Someone came to me once and said, we are interested in your figurative work. Our friend's got one of yours. Have you got any more like this? And I said, that was 35 years ago. I might have still have a figurative painting from that period, but I doubt it. You know, but they expect you to still be doing what you did 35 years ago. I mean, no one is doing, even a gardener's probably not doing the same, making the same garden. You know, so there is that, and I've been told by galleries who've shown my work in the last 10 years that older people have come in and said, what's happened to Tony Woods? I remember his work from the 60s. It was, you know, I've got two or one. Gee, he's gone downhill, hasn't he? You know, and all this sort of stuff. I mean, it's strange.